Hey gang, welcome to another study session. Today's focus will be Alsace, Jura, Savoie, and Bougie. We did this earlier in the syllabus, but I didn't love the content in the presentation. I really didn't love the outcome of the video quality either. So I went ahead and redid it. I'm doing this one, it's not a Sunday. I know that's a little bit strange, but we're gonna upload this to YouTube and get it in front of everybody for their educational needs. So with this, we're going to start with a general map of French wine regions. And I think it's important to note the areas that we're going to look at today on the eastern edge of France. We're going to look at Alsace, which of course famously sort of stretches into the Pfalz region of Germany here too. A little further south, you'll find the Jura region, just west of Switzerland. And then as we continue even further south, the Bougie region that sits right off of the Rhone as it cuts through Savoie and heads up into Lake Geneva. And we'll look at Savoie here as well today. But we start in Alsace. And I think this is a great map from Gildsam. It gives you a 30,000 foot flyover, so to speak. And the important things are all in this map together. You find the Vosges Mountains to the western edge of the AOP, which of course are very tall and create a rain shadow effect. They also do a lot of work in blocking clouds and creating a very sunny area here. To the east, on the eastern border of the region, is the Rhine River, right? It heads up into Germany and affects several different wine regions there. And what that does is create sort of a warming effect on the region. So you get a warming effect, you get no clouds, you get no rain. So you have a sun trap here. And because there's no rain, Colmar really is one of the driest cities in all of France. So you'll see here too, broken down into the Basse Rhine, the Haute Rhine in the south, and then the Alsace AOP that sits right here in the center of it. Some general history for the region. The Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War in 1648, giving France Alsace. 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, it went back to Germany. And then it was French again after the end of World War I. And then in 1940, it was reclaimed by the Germans until after World War II. So a lot of ping-ponging back and forth between France and Germany for Alsace. The best houses here are merchants first, and their growers second, thus making the vineyard designations of Grand Cru a lot less impactful. The addition of Vendage Tardive and Sélection Grand Noble sort of marked a movement away from dryness, which is really the opposite of what you're seeing in German styles. And it's become increasingly difficult to determine whether a wine will be dry or not. The climate here, as mentioned, the Vosges Mountains create a rain shadow, and sitting between them and the Rhine creates that sun trap. The summers here are very long and they're quite dry. As far as aspect and geography is concerned, there's only about 15 miles between the Rhine River and the Vosges Mountains. Of course, with that mountain chain to the west, you get east, southeast, and south-facing slopes. Otherwise, you'd be looking at a mountain and not getting very much sunlight. We spoke about this when we talked about Bordeaux and Burgundy, but pine forests in the area can lower the average temperature of a vineyard by 1 degree Celsius compared to one plant of the younger oaks, which is very important when we talk about the wines of Alsace. In general, your elevation sits between about 600 and 1,200 feet. We mentioned very little cloud cover. There's a handful of rivers in the area. Most of your slopes here are between 25 and 65 degrees. There's a ton of different soils all throughout Alsace. Your steeper mountain slopes, including in the Schlossberg Grand Cru, have granite, schist, and volcanic sediment. Your lower slopes have limestone, clay, and gravel. Limestone is pretty common near Heiligenstein and also in the Rossiter area, but not from the Closset Hoon bottling. There you'll find calcareous clay that's famous in Schonenberg. You also run into chalk, loess, and a local soil type known as Great of Vosges, which is a very interesting pink sandstone. If you look at the region again, you could sort of break it into three major areas of soil types, though. Once you get to the base of the Vosges Mountains, you sort of get a lot of silica. Then you get the limestone hills, and you get this hydrous alluvial plain. Grapes in Alsace are interesting, and we talk a lot about the noble grapes here. We're going to mention those as we talk about Grand Crus and Vintage Tardif and Sélection Grand Noble. So those noble grapes are Riesling, Pinot Gris, Muscat, and Gewürztraminer. Riesling is the most planted and the last to ripen. And we'll see that the reasoning behind some of the must waits for VT and SGN, whenever we get to that, is based upon the ripening. Pinot Gris, which was formerly known as Tokay d'Alsace or Tokay Pinot Gris, shows a little more spicy characteristics here. Muscat, Blanc Petit Grand, Hautenel, or Rosé Petit Grand. And then Gewürztraminer also shows a lot more spice characteristics. With Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris, I think a lot of the reasons you're seeing more spice here is that they're phenolically a little spicier, but also you're getting botrytis-affected grapes on occasion that will showcase more of the ginger or saffron characteristics of spice. Other grapes in the area, Pinot Noir, Pinot Blanc, known locally as Klevner, which represents the largest volume of appellation production when combined with Alsace, also known to be a little smoky. You find Alsace, you find Chasselas, and here locally it's known as Goutedel. You'll find Sylvaner, which is an interesting grape variety, and that it's the only non-noble grape allowed in one of the Grand Crus. We'll get to that in just a minute. You find Sauvignon, which we know of as coming from Jura, right? But here it's locally known as Klevener, not to be confused with Klevner. And famous around the Heiligenstein area, particularly in Heiligenstein, Borgheim, Gerdweiler, Coxweiler, and Oberdine. And then you will find a little bit of Chardonnay, but Chardonnay here is only for the production of the sparkling Cremant d'Alsace. Viticulturally, hazards include soil erosion and, of course, the occasional drought because they don't really get any rain. And then when we talk about these continental climates, you know, a lot of times spring frost is an issue, and you certainly see that here. And we've talked about it with other regions, and I think Bordeaux in particular, where they trellis their vines slightly higher to avoid any of those frost issues. ENCEPAGEMENTS and styles for the area, Cremant d'Alsace, dominated by Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Gris, and Alsace, but really Alsace is the driving force behind these wines. And then Vintage Tardif and Sélection de Grand Noble, those were added in 1984. They are single variety and they must pass a blind tasting panel. SGN wines are picked in trees and they suppress their varietal characteristic for notes of botrytis. Now, Vintage Tardif may show botrytis, but they emphasize varietal purity, and they're typically made from pasteurization or drying of the grapes. They're not obligated to be sweet, though SGN typically are, and VT can be pretty dry. They're definitely obligated to be hand harvested. The unenriched minimum sugar levels for must weights for Vintage Tardif, Riesling and Muscat at 244 grams per liter, and Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer 270. These changed recently. When I first wrote my note cards years ago, it was 235 and 256, I think, something like that. So if you have that old note card, burn that bad boy and rewrite it. SGN 276 for Riesling and Muscat, 306 for Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer. Now we know Riesling as being winter hardy, having a little more woody portions to the vine, and being later ripening. And so I think that has a lot to do with the fact that it doesn't achieve these higher must weights that you'll see in Pinot Gris and Gewürztraminer. With VT and SGN wines, there's no chaptalization. They have to be vintage dated. They're not released until June the 1st of the second year following the harvest. As for all of Alsace, all of the wines are bottled in what's known as a vin du Rhin, sort of a thin, tall bottle. As far as winery techniques that you can adjust, the new oak is typically not a factor, though foeder for fermentation or aging is not uncommon. And then malolactic is usually avoided, although famously not by the Trimbach family. Though in certain vintages like 2001, it happens spontaneously. The results here have a tendency to be more creamy and tactile than they do buttery. And that has a lot to do, I think, with the fact that they're probably foeder fermenting, which means that your fermentation is happening at a slightly higher temperature, and your yeasts that are eating sugars to create alcohol are also eating the diacetyl byproduct that malolactic would occur, which gives you creamy and tactile characteristics and not buttery. The first terminology things that you write down when you're reading about Alsace are Edelsbicker and Gentile. Edelsbicker is a noble mixture. It is an inexpensive blend that's actually not even required to be a blend, and it's not required to be vintage dated. And then Gentile, minimum of 50% of the noble grapes, and the base wines have to be vinified separately. Some deeper wine laws: varietally labeled wines have to be 100%. Alsace can be labeled as Pinot Blanc. White wines labeled as Pinot may include Gris, Blanc, Noir, or Alsace. Riesling has to be dry. And then I've always had this note about Grand Crus that are allowed to blend, right? Altenburg, Bergheim, and Kaffrkopf. I always knew those were the two that were allowed to blend. I never really bothered to get as in depth to find out what the blending requirements are. So Altenburg to Bergheim is a Riesling dominant blend when it is blended, and Kaffrkopf is a Gewürztraminer dominated blend when it is blended. We also mentioned before that there is one Grand Cru that allows for a non-noble grape, and that is Zotzenberg, that produces Sylvaner. All of your Grand Crus have to be hand harvested. Your sugar levels are higher than the Alsace AOP, and the yields are certainly restricted. Interesting, Pinot Gris Gewürztraminer minimum potential alcohol here is 11.5%. That's pretty darn high. That has a lot to do with the fact and speaks volumes to the amount of sunshine and ripeness that we get in this region. Your Grand Cru maximum yield is 55 hectoliters per hectare, and although for certain levels like VT and SGN, chaptalization is not allowed, but Grand Cru wines, you can do up to 1.5%. I would imagine with those slightly higher ABVs that are required here, if you've got a lean vintage, that might help out. Major subregions, your Grand Crus, again, typically single variety of noble grapes, though not required by law. Your largest is Schlossberg at 80 hectare. It was also the first back in 1975. There were then 24 added in 1983, 25 added in 1992, and finally Kaffrkopf added in 2007, giving us a grand total of 51 Grand Crus. In 2011, prior to 2011, Grand Cru was its own AOP. In 2011, each Grand Cru was given its own AOP. Kanzlerberg being the smallest at 3 hectare. A couple of ones that stand out: Steinkolz for Pinot Gris and Noir, and then Rangen for volcanic soils for Riesling and Pinot Gris, whereas in Umbrecht and Schufitz stand. But there's a bunch of these that aren't in, a bunch of clos at least, that aren't in Grand Cru, so we'll take a look at here in just a second. As far as producers are concerned, Marcel Diess tends to use their field blends under a vineyard name, which is Engelgarten, and I think there's 9 different grapes in that bad boy. Trimbach releases their Clos Saint Hoon, which is perhaps the most iconic wine of the region, with no mention of the Rossiter Grand Cru under just Alsace AOP. Although they do have a Grand Cru that was released in 2009 under the Giesberg Grand Cru. Hugel does not release admissible wines as Grand Cru. And then a couple of standouts, we're going to look at these Clos wines, but Clos de Capucines from Weinbach, Clos Jebzal and Winsbuel from Zinubrecht, and Ostertag, known for barrique usage. Here are the Clos wines that aren't included in the Grand Crus. We mentioned Capucines from Weinbach. I think Jebzal and Winsbuel are probably the most important. Rivo Pear is here too. And then you've got some producers in Albrecht, and Crichton Weiss and Albert Mann that are producing some also. I've never tasted those though. I'd love to get my hands on. I always hate giving you guys a vintage chart because, again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but here's the vintage chart. I've gotten to taste some wines, luckily, back to 76 to 83, and these are fantastic, and they're certainly aging quite lovely right now. So poor vintages you want to point out and just avoid 84, 91, and 2006 if you're building cellars. Which leads us through Alsace and into Jura. This is a map of the Jura AOPs. You can see the orange area, well, somewhat orange, not quite as orange as our Bois. This yellow-orange area, almost golden, if you will, represents the Côte de Jura, the Cremant de Jura, Macvin de Jura, and Marc de Jura, which are sort of your general appellation wines. You'll also find L'Etoile in yellow here, Château Chalon in a sort of burnt orange, and then Arbois here. Your AOPs of Jura, we mentioned the generic one from Côte de Jura, For Chef de Chalon, these wines are vin jaune, or yellow wine. They're made from 100% Sauvignon on these beautiful limestone and marl soils in barrel until December 15th of the 6th year after harvest. And they're aged under voile, which is very similar to flor. They're not fortified, and they have to be bottled in a clavelin, which is a 62 centiliter or 620 milliliter squat bottle. Then you have L'Etoile, whites only, typically from Chard, Pulsard, and Sauvignon, and they are produced in an oxidative style. And Arbois, which is oddly the home of Louis Pasteur. Here you have 12 communes covering all styles of wine. One important one, though, Pupillin may append its name. I should also note that Jura gets its name from the Jurassic area. It's on the wrong slide here. I apologize. That should be on the previous one. Here we're looking at Savoie and Bougie. And you'll see the Bougie area is separated here to the west by the Rhone River that cuts through, and the Rhone cuts up past Lake Bourget and ends into, well, it doesn't end, but goes through essentially Lake Geneva, otherwise known here as Lac Léman. So it's important to note in this region, you've got some moderating influences from the lakes of Bourget and Lake Geneva. You're just south of Switzerland in an alpine area. You'll notice here is Chambéry too. For those of you that might be familiar, there's an old AOP for dry vermouth that Dolene utilized for many years. I think that's gone now. I have to double check. You can see all the Vin de Savoie and the orange areas. This purple area is a cru named Crepy. We're going to look at a couple of other cru that sit right on the southern edge of Lake Geneva that require a minimum 80% chasselas. And then there's one other cru down here, and I don't see it listed, but it's on the wine folly map on the next slide for 100% Roussanne wines. You also get the Rousset de Savoie, which is right here. I don't know why they didn't highlight it, but these are 100% Alsace. There are 4 communes here: Frangy, Maristel, Montermino, and Montu. And then your Seyssel wine, which is on the west side of the Rhone, produces off-dry and dry styles of Mousseux for Alsace and Molette. I'm sorry, it's Mousseux and Still. We're going to look at Bougie a little more in depth on a slide here in just a minute. And we mentioned Rousset de Bougie for 100% Alsace. The wine folly map definitely shows the crus. You see Crepy, Marignan, Ripaille, and then down here is Chignon Bergeron. So Chignon Bergeron is 100% Roussanne, and these other 3 are 80% minimum chasselas. And then you can see your Rousset de Savoie here for 100% Alsace. Great. Continental climates, harsh winters. We mentioned the lake effects. Lake Geneva is the largest body of fresh water in Western Europe. And then back up in Jura, I should have moved this one, but vineyards rest on the mountain lower slopes and limestone and marl with substantial clay at slopes points. Grapes, this is going to cover both Jura, Savoie for white and red. For Chardonnay, for whites in the Jura, you'll find Chardonnay, which is Gamay Blanc. Sauvignon, otherwise known as Traminer, Jacquard and Savoie, Alsace, Bergeron, which is Roussanne, and Chardonnay, and of course Chasselas. In the Jura for reds, you'll find Pulsard, Trousseau, and Pinot Noir, and in Savoie, you'll find Gamay, Mondouse, and Pinot Noir. Terminology, we mentioned Chignon Bergeron being that 100% Roussanne cru of Savoie. Marignan, Ripaille, and Crepy are the crus in the north, just south of Lake Geneva, that are 80% chasselas. Bougie has its own set of terminology here. Bougie labeled as Manicle is 100% Chardonnay or Pinot Noir. Bougie labeled as Montagnou is 100% Mondouse for Rouge, or it can be made into a sparkling Mousseux or Pétillant with a minimum 70% Mondouse. And then you have Bougie Sardin, which is probably the one that we're all most familiar with. I've certainly seen it more common than the others. It is his method ancestral production of Gamay and Pulsard that's aged on the lees for 2 months to reach a minimum of 3 atmospheres, a maximum of 3 atmospheres of pressure. No, it is a minimum, but a little softer style. Right? Your rosés here are typically vin gris in style. And of course, the vin jaune is Sauvignon only. Before we get too far, I think it's important also to note vin de paille, which in this area can be labeled as Côte de Jura, Arbois, and L'Etoile from Jura. Vin de Paille is ripe but unbotchetized grapes dried for 6 weeks after harvest. Some use straw mats traditionally, though boxes and hanging are employed today. The must weight exceeds 320 grams per liter with a minimum of 170. ABV exceeds 19%. And they're 3 years aged with 18 months in neutral barrel. And then also for Jura, Cremant de Jura was established in 1995 for method traditional wines. For your local vin de liqueur, Mac Vin de Jura is made by using aged marc and unfermented grape must. So this can be red, white, or pink, and it's aged for 1 year in oak after boutage. That's my show. I hope you enjoyed the study session for Alsace, Jura, Savoie, and Bougie. It's a little bit interesting. We did it on a day. It's not Sunday, so I'm going to get this chunked up on YouTube for everybody. If you have questions, fire them off in the comments section or send them to me directly. I'd love to hear them. Cheers.